Hello, hello. This is Ali Decker, and you're listening to the Long Game Podcast. Today, I chat with longtime Twitter friend Maddy Osman, founder of the Blogsmith and author of Writing for Humans and Robots: The New Rules of Content Style, which she released earlier this year. I invited her on today's episode to discuss a number of things, including how she's grown her agency out of her own freelance writing career, her work around process creation and automation, and how she's leveraged her processes to power her agency, and her thoughts around the recent Google algorithm update dubbed the Helpful Content Update, and how these updates have woven into what she wrote in her book. I think you'll enjoy our chat today, so without further ado, here's Maddy. All right. Well, thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to talk to you. Maddy, I'd love to hear in your words, what do you do all day?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it certainly depends on the day, but usually sitting in front of my computer, running the Blogsmith, my content company, and working with our team that's pretty much all over the world. And so a day could be meeting with clients. It could be helping to approve content in our workflow. It could be building processes to make the agency run more efficiently, or it could be trips to Vegas. This was the case.
I'm coming back to that later in this conversation because I want to talk more about that.
Absolutely.
So what would you say your role is? Obviously founder of the Blogsmith, but if you had to give a short job description, provided what you do every day, how would you define that?
Sure. I think what I want it to be and what I'm moving towards is something to do with growth. And right now that includes things like business development.
Okay.
Branding, being on podcasts is one way to do that. Speaking at different events and getting the word out basically through other people's channels about what we do. I think that's the role that I want to have for now. In addition to kind of going back to the process building idea, I like building things. I like creating things. That's kind of my web designer background. Before I did all this, that's what I did.
Wow.
And I realized that that's not the perfect fit role for me for where I am today, but I think it still plays into what I like to do.
Yeah, like how your brain works.
Yeah. And so I think that what I'm trying to get away from is being sort of the person who's in charge of the day-to-day, meeting with clients, responding to things that are happening within our workflow that somebody else maybe has the answer to. And so that's kind of what I'm building towards right now.
Yeah, I can relate to the pulling yourself out of the weeds thing, not just because it's not really scalable, but it's also there's people that are better at some of that stuff than you are, especially as things change and grow, industries change and everything. So totally. I definitely want to hear more about this web designer background. Sure. I did not know that.
Yeah, I feel like I hide it now almost. But
no, I love it.
It is the reason why we work with a lot of WordPress brands, because it kind of comes from that background. And so basically, when I was much younger, I think I was 11, I taught myself HTML and CSS. I found this really cool website called Clarissa Explains It All, kind of like the, Melissa Joan Hart sort of show from way back. Yeah. And lots of bold, bright colors. I could visualize it right now, but it was a very approachable, here's how to code for beginners. And so I ran with that. I customized my Neopets page.
Oh my gosh.
My MySpace profile eventually.
That's amazing.
That's where it started. And then in college, I was looking, what could I do on campus? It could work at one of the big campus positions, like one of the food halls or whatever, but don't really want to do that. And I saw an opening for a web design position at, now it's called Student Life Marketing and Design, but it's basically we would work with the student orgs or the bookshop and whatever their website needs are, whatever their marketing needs are. And so that's where I that's where I kind of put my skills to the test.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also where I discovered that I really liked content, because I think my boss noticed like I'm a little bit like more of like a chatty person than the average web developer. And they had some need for help with like the student life blog and social media channels.
Okay.
And so that's where it started.
So where'd you go to school again?
University of Iowa.
Oh my God, my dad went there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we're like huge Hawkeye fans.
How
How did I not know this? Oh my goodness.
Let's the game in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. We usually like to go to Kinnick around like Thanksgiving, depending on who they're playing. But oh my gosh, we're definitely coming back to that.
So much fun.
College jobs. Yeah, that's where I first got into writing too, the newspaper, and a couple other things. But yeah, it's interesting what you say about like the education aspect of your job. I feel like more so now with social media and blogging and just general like this, I don't know, culture of education, which is really great because there's so much at our disposal. But some stuff takes a lot of domain expertise and kind of like training on the back end. Like not everyone can teach web design, just like you can't really Google it and then write about it. Like some topics you can. So how did that play a role in where you are? I guess we'll start a little bit smaller. When you founded the Blogsmith, I remember working with you back at HubSpot, and you wrote a lot about WordPress and HTML and CSS and everything. What was the leap like from where you were in college to kind of the beginnings of the Blogsmith?
Sure. So I took on a couple full-time jobs after I graduated, and I freelanced to the side. That also came from that college job. My boss, he had a freelance website design project, and he just like didn't have time to do it. And so he passed it off to me. And that's when I realized I could work for myself. I needed like the permission almost.
Right.
But after that, I started freelancing on the side of those full-time jobs, all sorts of stuff, social media, blogging, websites, just, whatever anybody would hire me for, of course. And from there, I basically had one client that represented a lot of work, ongoing, kind of like this promise that I would have this ongoing work. And this person I had done a couple of articles for, and then he had like a greater need. He needed some social media help for his clients. He needed other articles for his clients, etc. And so he was kind of testing out the idea of having like a virtual assistant, which would be me.
Okay.
And then, so that gave me the confidence to quit my full-time job and know that I would at least have like rent, like is taken care of. And then I just need to kind of hustle for everything else that I wanted and need. And that's when I started freelancing. And then when it became more of like this agency model, I think I just realized I had a realization that I didn't want to do all the things. I really liked content. I thought that was something I could build a repeatable process around, because you could do that with social and web design, but it's just going off into different tangents.
Yeah.
And so that's when whenever I had that realization, I started to hire more people, build the pieces necessary to scale into that model, documenting everything, basically being all the different positions so that I could document them and then train someone else, like account management, project management, keyword research, editing.
Wow. That's incredible.
It was fun, but it was also like, I'm happy to hire somebody else to do these things.
Yeah. Yeah. Kind of the power of like replacing yourself. Exactly. I want to talk a little bit more about the process side of things, like process and then documentation. I know that was what our call was about like a year or so ago. Just like you were like the process queen. And I was like, please help me. I know that comes from, like you said, your web development, web designer background, but how did you get started with that? Was that something you knew you needed to do from the beginning? Was process like documentation in order to hire, or did you like learn through trial and error? Like, how did you kind of come about that?
Yeah, it definitely trial and error.
I think that's what most people say. I feel like documentation does not come easily to like anybody. It's like not fun to like basically do the job twice. Is what it feels like for me, at least.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of everybody's opinion of it. It's definitely creating a harder initial task, but the goal, of course, is that it gets smoother from here on out. So that's kind of the thing that I keep in the back of my head.
Yeah.
I think that like I had a business degree. I feel like the things that we covered are probably mostly applicable to what I do now. But one of the things I wish that they would have taught us was process improvement, process creation. I think it is something that you get into if you're more on like the operations side of things. So if like my degree was more on that side, or maybe if I had gotten an MBA or something, maybe it would have come into play. But it's so fundamental for whether you run a business, whether you're part of a business. I can't think of somebody who wouldn't benefit from that knowledge. So I feel like that was totally left out of my education.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I also have a business degree and I don't remember talking about that at all.
It wasn't even
touched. We talk about the 4 P's of marketing. So
of course,
as long as we learn that, right? So what would you say, even through today, are like the 3 most important processes that you have set up at the Blogsmith?
Sure. Our biggest one is our content production workflow. And I will say that how I like decided that was the way I wanted to go, how I structured and developed that, it really came from not finding what I wanted in project management tools. So like or Asana or whatever. I couldn't find exactly what I wanted. And so then I started using this tool called Process Street, which allowed me to build whatever I wanted within kind of the limits of, whatever tools they have, whatever sort of variables and functions that they have within their builder. But it's pretty comprehensive. Almost anything I can think of, I can build with that tool. And there's others like it. That just happens to be my favorite. So I guess like a piece of useful feedback for anybody listening is like, maybe if you're having a problem with like project management, maybe it's a process management problem.
What would you say is the difference? Like if you could define it, obviously the words are different, but in your experience.
Yeah. And I think you still need some sort of project management functionality. So for us, it's been Google Sheets, which is a little funky, but we're moving it to Airtable to be kind of like, here's everything that's happening and just like the high level details. But process management is the minutia. So it's like, when does the editor need to touch this? And I don't want them to touch it until, it's their time and the outline's approved or the draft's approved, whatever it is that they specifically need to be involved with, not getting that sort of like ping in their inbox until it really is time, because otherwise it's just a distraction and it's consuming.
So what was the typical project management tools? What were they missing for you?
It's a couple things. Some of them, it's like I couldn't figure out how to get the notification settings right. So it was like overdoing it. Some of it wouldn't let me get really granular with task management. And I think the thing that's interesting about Process Street is that you can add sort of like inline comments and details. So it's like, it's maybe the task is write an outline. And so in Process Street, I can add in like the link to our template. And I could also add some conditional logic that, this particular client wants us to use this template, or these things definitely need to be present. And so conditional logic is another huge part of it for me. There are some options for that on some of the project management tools I've used, but not to the level that I can get in Process Street.
Interesting. Yeah, I remember us talking about that. We didn't end up using it at the time, but as we get into more complicated projects and need like more templated like processes, it's always been on the back of my mind ever since you told me about it. Is there anything missing from that tool that you'd say, or has it worked pretty well for you?
It's worked pretty well. I think whenever there is an issue, they're really open to feedback and you can tell they're working on it. Yeah. I will say it's maybe even a better fit for like an enterprise business in general. That's kind of how they build themselves. So there's probably more support even for, bigger businesses that have bigger contracts with them or whatever. But I found them to be very, very good with feedback, taking it, making things better in light of that. And just to give you a couple other ideas of like different processes. So it's like our whole content workflow, but then it's also things like we have a workflow for like our account manager and project manager. And so every day it's like reminder to do this and like give us a report on this. And it's just prompts. And you can also, another thing that's cool about Process Street is they have an approvals feature. So you can get a ping when something's ready, when somebody checks it off. And then if there is anything you have to do, or if you need to send it back to them, it's kind of built in. And then another big workflow that we use in Process Street is hiring, because a lot of those steps are repeatable. You know, you can kind of fashion up email templates within there, and then you can also use variables. So it's like I already entered the person's name here, but it can pull to all the emails.
Right.
So it's just the whole point of Process Street for me is to take the brain work out of the things that we do all the time.
So how do you iterate on those processes?
Not easily. We're actually working with Adam of Build the Process right now. We're actually doing a trade, which is always fun in business, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So we're doing a trade where we're helping him with some of his content for his website, because I don't think they've actually launched their website yet, or they haven't kind of like fleshed it out completely. But we're doing a trade where he knows Process Street backwards and forwards. And so he's rebuilding our main content workflow with all the things that he knows about process improvement that like I'm just a newbie at, and I could probably get to that point if I studied it very closely for a couple of years.
Yeah.
He already knows it. And so I think one thing for sure is we've been maybe at a disadvantage at the Blogsmith in that I'm the only one who knows the tool backwards and forwards. So I'm the bottleneck. Yeah. But now that we're working with Adam on this big process, we're going to benefit so much from all the knowledge that he has.
That reminds me of those like Notion experts that know like Notion in and out. And I'm over here just like, how do I add a new page? Like, I don't know how to use this as well. That's a good idea. I like the trade idea. I actually traded. I built my wedding planner's website for her services for free.
Oh, that's perfect.
That's the only trade I've ever done, but I feel like I
should have done that.
that more. Yeah, she didn't have a website at all. And I was like, you're way too talented to not have an online presence. She would like, people would text her and stuff. I'm like, no, this doesn't work. And now she's booked all the way through 2023.
Heck yeah.
And I'm like, there you go, girl.
Teamwork.
I have so many questions to ask you. I wanted to double down on the process thing.
Sure.
So when you hear the phrase like content operations, like how does that relate to you? And I know everyone has these little definitions, but like, how does that relate to like how you use Process Street and how like you've grown Blogsmith, and like, what does that look like for you right now?
Sure. I think, yeah, when I hear about operations, just like the word in general, it's like, what's everything that could go wrong, right?
Yeah.
What is the normal state of affairs that we're trying to make happen? And I think that Process Street reinforces the norm very well. Like that's the point of it for me, to have a process management tool is to kind of reinforce the norm, to sort of set expectations for what I want to see at each level, at the outline, at the writing, at the editing stage, at the keyword research stage. But I think it also, the way that we've built it and the way that you should build out any process is to anticipate the problems.
Mm-hmm. So how did you like solve for that while building it out? Like was it because you'd seen like previous problems happen before you used Process Street and you knew to anticipate them, or is it different for different client projects? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a little bit of both. I think when I started it was, what are the things that I can anticipate being a problem? Like if something has to go for multiple rounds of edits, like the status quo is that things maybe take one round of edits, but there are times where it takes 2 or 3. If it's a very complicated piece of content, that could happen. And it's not the norm, but I need to have a mechanism in place so that the team doesn't come back to me to say, well, what do we do?
Okay. Yeah, that's a really good point. Kind of anticipate where there might be questions.
Right. And like, again, the whole point is to not be a bottleneck. I don't want anybody to be a bottleneck if we already have an answer or a possible, just even like something to think about. And I think that's an important thing to consider with process creation too, is that you may not be able to plan for every single possibility, right? There's just too many. But the more you can do to document your response in a certain situation, the better off you're going to be in the future. And so like one thing that we've done outside of Process Street in Airtable, because again, we're just kind of like experimenting with it and figuring out the best use cases. But basically, I've trained our project manager and account managers. Whenever you see some sort of client issue over email, like, first of all, I want to know about it. I'll definitely weigh in if I have anything that I can add to it. But ultimately, once you've solved it, like, let's document that. So we basically have a database that's like, here's kind of like the client question that somebody had to investigate because we didn't have a ready answer for that specific situation. And then here's one thing that you could maybe do to solve it. Here's how we did solve it. So it's using actual examples,
right?
Client communications. And again, it's not gonna be something that helps in 100% of situations, but even if it helps in like 40% of them,
oh yeah,
it's a totally good use of time.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I feel like so many people talk about process and talk about documentation and all that stuff. But like I said, I don't know, 10 minutes ago or whatever, it's just doesn't come very naturally, especially for like independent contributors or practitioners. Like, I feel like maybe managers have gotten into the habit, or now at your point, like a founder or anything, but it's such a habit to build. And what's funny is it feels like it should be easy because you're just doing your job, but like writing about it or, writing it all down. But it's not. It's not easy. One thing you said about Process Street that was interesting, you said it was built for the enterprise client, but it seems like as a solo founder, seems to really have helped you out, if not just remove you from the minutia.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's interesting that my coding background to some extent factors into that, because it is a no code tool, or maybe low code. There's like some things that you could code into it, but it's that like logical way of thinking, like if this, then that, the sort of like conditional logic, or like, how does, this task build on that one? And so because I had that background, I think that helped me to be successful with this tool. So yeah, I think while it was maybe built for the enterprise, it probably has a team of people who can, fix things or make new things, whatever. If you do have that mindset going into it, then I think you would pick up on it very quickly. So
I see.
Yeah. So I to your point, I agree that, like, just because it's maybe focused towards enterprise, there are a lot of applications for people who think in sort of that coding mindset.
Yeah. Well, speaking of coding, speaking of your background, I want to talk a little bit more about how you grew the Blogsmith and what role your like subject matter expertise played in growing that agency. So I know you said a lot of your clients are WordPress clients, if not WordPress plugins or tools. What kind of role has that played in how you positioned your agency and developed new business? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Totally. Yeah. So I think I realized really early on in the freelance writing part of my career that the technical topics, they tended to pay better. There was maybe less competition to get those jobs because not everybody has that WordPress background or coding background.
Yeah.
And so that was a realization that happened just by nature of diving in and doing a lot of different things and figuring out what was actually a fit. And it kind of just, as I got more bylines in those spaces, it led to other things. It led to other relationships. Another thing that has been important for solidifying sort of my position in the WordPress space, I think, is going to the WordCamp events. So for anybody who doesn't know what that is, WordCamps are regional conferences. They typically are not for profit. So it's like a $25 entry fee. You get speakers, you get lunch, you get, networking opportunities. And the WordPress Foundation and sponsors basically, what's the word I'm looking for? Subsidize like the ticket. Because WordPress is this open source landscape thing. They believe, we should all have equal access to the internet to be able to publish our thoughts. And so the ethos is kind of part of those WordCamp events. And so that tends to be a really great place to meet other people in the space, especially those needing content. Web hosts tend to be some of the biggest sponsors of WordCamps. They always have people there, and plugins and things like that. So I've been an attendee. I've been an organizer for the Denver WordCamp.
That's cool.
It's been fun, except for the 2020 version.
Anything that happened in 2020 was just like, that wasn't as fun as it could have been. No, I love how much there's a community there. I mean, it's got to make it easier for networking, education, business development, and just like staying connected to folks, in what would I imagine could be a very remote kind of job that you're in, this business you built for yourself.
100%. Yeah, no, the community is so cool. I just got a note card in the mail from somebody that I've worked with in the past. We'll see if it'll let me show you. Maybe if I put it right in front of my face, but it says, I can't wait to see you, from Michelle Frechette, who we're going to WordCamp US in a couple weeks for the first time in like 2 or 3 years.
That's amazing.
And, it's just like people are really thoughtful and sweet, and like you do make like legit friendships. And so that's what led to business in the WordPress space. It was being reliable, producing content that did have that technical background, hiring writers as I grew the agency model who did have experience with WordPress, even if it wasn't super in depth or back end developer stuff, but they had maybe managed their own WordPress site. And so they knew the front end really well. And so kind of how that's led us to position the Blogsmith is as a company. And I think we're, maybe even moving away from like the WordPress stuff, but the idea that we can help translate, for example, your release notes for like a SaaS tool into something that, somebody else can understand.
Yeah. Yeah. Having that like translation knowledge. That's really cool. What are some of the favorite projects you've worked on? You don't have to name clients if you don't want to, but just like either the challenge you had to solve or the type of product you were working on, or maybe people that were really kind to you, like whoever sent you that note.
Yeah. So Michelle represents Nexus, which is a pretty big client of ours, a web host. And one thing that was really cool, and I'm sure that you experienced this too, at the beginning of the pandemic, or even just like during the pandemic, a lot of people were coming online. So they needed content, right? Whether that was on a website or emails or even their social pages or whatever, they needed to be able to effectively communicate the state of affairs with people that were looking for them online, because we didn't really have these like retail spaces we could gather anymore. And so Nexus became a client either a year, maybe 2 years ago. And it was really because they wanted to build out their e-commerce topics for that small business owner who doesn't know WordPress, doesn't really have time for it, right? But they want to be able to quickly get up and running, be effective, find the right tools for the job in terms of plugins and stuff like that. And so, yeah, working with them has been great. Another thing that's kind of cool is they are one of the first clients who took us up on some of our a la carte services. So like one thing that we really kicked off with them was doing edits for other freelancers, because they didn't have the capacity to do that on their team. And so I think that's something that the Blogsmith does well, is like be a resource for teams that are understaffed or they want to scale up, and the most quick way to do that is to work with an outside partner. And so, yeah, that's been a cool project. One that comes to mind in the WordPress space as well, from maybe 2 years ago. This was when I was still doing some of the writing. I'm not really doing much of the writing at this point, but I did a piece for Code in WP. It's another WordPress resource site. They offer some themes and some digital products and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But they're most well known for, I would say, like their blog. And so they hired me to do like a 10,000 word investigational piece. And it was about my experience selling on Fiverr, because I used to do a lot of business on Fiverr actually. And I was on their pro marketplace, so I could actually charge like a reasonable
Yeah.
fee.
Yeah.
And so the piece is basically, and I can send it to you after this in case it's something that might be interesting to link to, but
yeah,
it's basically like everything that I did to be able to make like a couple grand per month on Fiverr without like having to do $5 orders or whatever.
Yeah. So you've had clients that have pulled from your personal experience too. Do you do a lot of journalism?
Not so much. It's really just an every once in a while thing, which is why that project stands out to me.
Right.
But I think it's always fun to do that. And I think a lot of our old blog posts on the Blogsmith blog, back when it was really just me writing it comes from that perspective. It's like, this is my experience with the tool. This is like my review, but it's a little bit like rambly and, a whole lot of like extra stuff that like may or may not be necessary, but it's like, but this is my experience.
Yeah. Well, and one thing you've worked on recently is your book that you just released. Did you like that? Did you like that segue? That was really
a good segue.
Tell me more about that. That's really freaking cool.
Thank you so much. So that was a pandemic project. I think, November 2020. I always wanted to do NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month for those unaware. And it's basically a month where you try to just chip away at a book every single day. So the goal is to write 1,667 words, which anybody who's a writer, that's like totally achievable.
Yeah, that's easy.
It
just depends on what you're writing about.
Right. And it's a lot back to back to back, weekends, all that stuff. But it's totally achievable if you have an idea. And so my idea was, we have the style guide, the Blogsmith style guide, which was a big part of, honestly, scaling my business from freelancer to agency. I figured, like, if I'm going to hire writers to represent me, I need to give them a ton of direction, right?
Right.
I need to have some sort of documentation reference point for what our style even is. And so the style guide came from that. I worked with our early editors on it. We continuously add to it as things come up, as we think of new additions. But the book was really an attempt to sort of flesh that out. So the style guide has like a rule, right? And it has different headings, different things where you can look as a reference point. The book is more about adding context, the why.
Okay.
As well as examples of like, don't do this, do this instead, based on actual edits.
Right. Yeah. Examples. So the concept of writing for humans and robots, was that the title of your style guide, or did you kind of alter the narrative for the publishing?
Yeah, I altered the narrative for sure. And so it's like, when I did NaNoWriMo, I kind of went into it with the outline of the style guide, and basically like each section was going to be sort of a chapter that I would flesh out, or possibly multiple chapters if there were different angles to take on it. And so I wrote all the chapters, but then I went through edits. I had several different editors. I had like a professional book editor do it to make sure it was the right formatting. I had my mom look at it because she's an English teacher in the past. I knew she would take me to task on anything that was wrong.
Okay.
And it was good that she edited it too, because she's not in the industry.
Yeah.
Anything that like just didn't make sense at all, it's like, I want to know.
Yeah.
And then I had my team edit it as well. But basically through the series of different edits, I started to get a better idea of like, okay, well, what am I going to call this thing? And then how does the idea of the book as a whole translate to how the chapters are arranged? So it started one way, and then the writing for humans and robots really didn't come till the very end of the process.
Really? How did that pop out? Like, where did you get that name?
So when I was rearranging the chapters, I was trying to create sort of sections. And so I was like, well, a lot of this stuff is sort of SEO related.
Right.
And it doesn't get super into the weeds with that because I didn't want to write something that was immediately going to be irrelevant, out of date. So it's not like making like a ton of tool recommendations or like very specific keyword research strategies. It's more like, here's what you need to understand about SEO to dive in more on your own, really. And so I was like, okay, so a lot of this is about sort of SEO, and then a lot of this is about the reader themselves, like the human. And so I think that's kind of what sparked it, was just comparing the two like main sections of the book. And then, the whole point of the style guide that we created is really to write for the human, but it's to also weave in the SEO side of things. So it's just the balance between the two.
That's awesome. It's funny timing too with this new like algorithm release.
Oh yeah.
How have you like posted anything about that or have any like commentary about that?
So I've definitely been digging in and just kind of seeing like what Google's been saying about it. And for the most part, it seems like it's like many things Google has vaguely told us before without getting into the weeds of every single ranking factor. But the idea that if you create great content for humans, then like it has a place on Google and people will likely find it. And so I think like what I try to get across in the book is write for the human, but weave in keywords, be thoughtful about the idea of indexing. And ultimately, the robot isn't the one who's going to buy from you, but they are the one who can surface your content to a human who does want to buy from you at the time when they're looking for someone like you. So yeah, I think that's the thing to keep in mind in writing in general. It's just that the robot can't buy from you. So don't prioritize them.
Wow. Yeah. That's a huge, I feel like people know that, but they don't really know that. Like, I feel like the concept of the vanity metric and like the vanity goals, I feel like there's been so much, I don't know, chaos that folks focus on in the short term, like right in front of them. And they forget, like, that's why, we try to index on like versions and stuff, and clearly search traffic and all of that is so important, but it's kind of like a checkpoint. It's not the finish line. Right. And I don't know. I think a lot of, it's been a good conversation that this algorithm has created. I don't like you said, I don't think Google's doing anything like new really, or surprising. Right. Like even their blog post about the algorithm update was like pretty simple. Like it wasn't anything like specific. I know they said the industry is like tech, like house goods, I think, or a couple things were going to be like targeted, but it wasn't very specific. So I was like, this seems just like a good thing. Like I don't see a lot of bad or complicated out of this. So, but yeah, I love that phrase. Robots aren't going to buy from you.
It's so polarizing though, like the phrase writing for humans and robots, like everybody has an opinion who works in content. They're like, oh, well, I don't think about the robots at all or whatever. And it's like, that's fine, but you're like missing an opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting being a part of so many bigger content teams, and like the day to day, like in the weeds. There's so much like focus on the keyword research and the keywords and like the SERP intent and all this stuff. And it's like, that's almost like the pre-gaming, right? Like that's not like the main event at all, but because there's like so much research involved and so much emphasis on this and so many tools that talk about this and like so many things that go into build, like preparing and strategizing for the content, because of you're leveraging that distribution channel. By the time you get pen to paper, it's like you kind of don't emphasize as much of the human side. So for the folks, and this is my limited experience, but like for the folks that do emphasize the human side, they might be thinking they're better or different or whatever, but you're right. They're missing an opportunity. It just comes down to like balancing those two, which sounds like the whole premise of your book.
Yeah. And I think another thing to keep in mind too is like, one step I think a lot of people do with keyword research is literally going back to Google and like, what does autocomplete say about this keyword? What does people also ask and related searches say? All that data is based on human searches.
Yeah. Yeah. Human behavior. My co-founders and I were joking one episode. I don't remember which one. We were like, how much, I think we were calling into question like monthly search volume, just as a metric, it's really an estimate, like on all tools, because it's different across the board, right? Like Ahrefs, SEMrush, even those keyword everywhere tools. And we were like, how much of that estimated monthly search volume is actually other writers looking for like content to like either research or be inspired by, or just analyzing the SERPs and everything. I'd love to know.
That
it's a lot.
Investigational piece.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I mean, it's hard to trust any of those estimates. If anything, it just gives you, like you said, kind of a behavioral look into things. Like if some term has like 4 or 5 digit MSV versus 2-digit MSV, like clearly the behavior is different, but all the way down to like the single digit, like 250 versus 300, it's like, that's a hard call to make, I think. And that's when I think people focus so much on search, like the robot optimization, if you want to call it.
Right.
Not the human reader element. So I feel like I could talk about this forever.
It's fun to dig into the SERPs. I
know. No, I feel like my opinion about all this stuff has been changing over the years, and it's been good though. I mean, the industry as a whole has changed a lot since I even started at HubSpot. So I think it's kind of, you're meant to change your mind and kind of go with the flow. And
100%. Yeah. You can't stick with what the rules were from 1 year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And kind of like what we were talking about at the beginning, just like the process improvement creation stuff. It's interesting because it's one of those things that like we never learned about in school. Like it wasn't really a thing back then. And so you kind of have to like forge your own destiny. And that's kind of cool.
Yeah, that is really cool. Well, I'm going to ask a couple questions that I ask everybody because I'd love to know your answers. What is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Oh, that is a great question.
It doesn't have to do with content marketing if you don't want it to.
Sure. I'm a big proponent of the idea of like mentoring and mentorship relations. So like both having a mentor, but also being a mentor. And I think some of the best advice I ever got was if you are working with someone who's like a little bit further ahead in their career and you want to, get that knowledge from them, you want to connect with them, you can never really repay their time because again, they're kind of like at a different level than you're at. And you're probably, not in like a position where you could pay like high consulting fees anyway. But what you should consider doing is figuring out like what their favorite organization is and like volunteering for that organization and showing support and appreciation for them and something that's important to them with your time instead of your money. So that's kind of a random tip, but.
No, I think that's awesome. I think mentorship is not talked about a lot. I think there's definitely like organizations, like things you can be a part of like formally, but that just mentor-mentee relationship, I don't think it's like, you can't just ask someone to mentor. I mean, maybe you can, I don't know. I've never done that. I feel like there's gotta be, and everyone's so busy these days. And especially if it's someone, like you said, who's more advanced than you, like they're less likely to have the time.
Right.
But I think that's a really good piece of advice. I've actually been thinking about like my next mentor relationship, and I'm going to keep that in mind.
And then I'll add a B point to that. I have gotten some really solid mentorship support from SCORE, which is the Small Business Advisory. So like the government of the US has these offices in major cities. So there was one in Chicago. Now I live in Denver. There's one in Denver. And it's a free program. You can meet with your mentor as many times as you want. My Denver mentor is like a Stanford grad. He went to West Point. He was a successful business executive and he's like retired now and he just like enjoys mentoring.
Oh my gosh.
So if you're ever like, I can't find a mentor, I don't know where to start, check out SCORE. I think it's just like literally score.org. You kind of fill out a little like personality, here's kind of where I'm at in my business profile thing. And then they match you. And he's since introduced me to like another mentor. And so like, that is a free resource. That's what our tax dollars go towards to use it.
That's amazing. I'm definitely going to look into that.
Do it. I highly recommend it.
Awesome. Well, my last question, what's one thing that you believe about, we'll say content marketing, because that's most of what we talked about, that others would disagree with? Love those contrarian opinions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably what we've already discussed, which is just that you can satisfy the human and the robot without necessarily taking away from either one of them. I think it is a balancing act. I think you have to be very purposeful and strategic in how you do it, but it is definitely possible. So don't get discouraged, or I guess like let the naysayers think that focusing on the robot at all would be to a disadvantage to the human.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love that perspective, and calling it like a robot, I think really helps separate like the two people. There you go. The two things to satisfy, like when you're thinking about content.
100%.
Well, the last thing I'll ask you is if there's anything that you want to share with our listeners, anything you'd like to promote, where they can find you online.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm probably most active on Twitter at Maddy Osman. You can check out the Blogsmith at theblogsmith.com. Luckily got that domain name after a while. Not initially. Good. Pull out for your dreams, everyone. And then check out my book, Writing for Humans and Robots, The New Rules of Content Style. I wrote it even without knowing about the helpful content update, but I think it is a good thing to keep in mind with that rolling out in these next couple weeks here.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining me, Maddy.
Thank you so much for having me.